Hey. So this is day 6. This is for January 6th. Moving on. After that big breakdown of like sin. And now we are at Genesis 4, verses 1 through 26. And this is a breakdown of what happens. And it's mainly about Cain, Abel, and Seth. All right. So, breaking it down event for event, right? So what happens is the first thing, boom, we got two brothers, we got two different offerings. So what that means is Eve gives birth to Cain and then to Abel. And so they grow in different roles. So Cain works the ground. So essentially Cain is a farmer and Abel keeps the flocks. He tends to the flocks. So that means he's a shepherd, right? Both of them bring offerings to God. So Cain brings some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord in the course of time. And then Abel brings fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. And then it says that the Bible says that God looks with favor on Abel and his offering, but does not look with favor on Cain and his offering. So Cain's internal response is immediate. He becomes very angry. His face falls, like face drops, right? So think resentment, think humiliation, okay? Internal rage. But what this portion right here is highlighting or introducing is the posture of like the giving. So the quality, right? Abel offered the firstborn, okay? The fat portions, whereas Cain, over the course of some time, he just offered like some. And so what happens is that that's going to be significant later. So boom, Cain has become angry, his face drops, and then now God is going to confront Cain before crisis happens. So God speaks directly to Cain. Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? And then God gives Cain a warning and a choice. If you do what is right, you will be accepted and lifted up. If you do not, sin is crouching at the door. It desires to control you, but you must rule over it. God already knows. God be knowing. Like, you have a choice in this, but I'm knowing and I'm aware of what you're feeling, but you have a choice in this. So sin is like, it's pictured as like this predator at the door. And Cain is not treated as helpless. He is warned early, but he is given agency. Okay? You have a choice in this matter. What are you going to do? And he is called to master, to rule over his emotions instead of surrender or succumb to them. All right? So then next we have the first murder. Envy now leads to violence. Cain ends up speaking to Abel, okay, inviting him out to the field. They go out into the field. They end up in the field. And Cain basically attacks Abel and he kills him. And so this is the first time death occurs by human hands in the Bible. And it's not an accident. So it is what has been disrupted inside. So internal disruption has now flowed outwardly, right? We had anger, envy, hatred to violence. Okay. And so then God questions now Cain, all right, because here it comes again. inviting the accountability after sin. So God asks Cain, like, where's your brother Abel? And Cain comes back with the, I don't know, am I my brother's keeper? And it's like God responds like, what have you done? Like, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. And this one right here was good because it says the Bible is teaching here that one, violence is not invisible and justice has a voice, but the whole idea of God hears what people try to bury. And I'm like, dang, like, when I think about like, the stuff that, there go that shame again. The things I'm trying to hide, like, God still hears that. The stuff you trying to bury, trying to tuck down deep down inside, God still hears that. And then, so now here comes the consequences. This is the judgment, okay? So Cain is cursed from the ground. Again, another punishment that is like tied to the person's identity. So it says like the ground that received Abel's blood will now resist Cain. Cain was a farmer, purpose, identity. Okay, that's who he was. And it says he will be a restless wanderer. All right. On earth. So Cain's identity was tied to the ground. And so this consequence now, basically, it just strikes the center of Cain's life and security. And when I think about like consequences and things like that and where they hit the hardest at, they are tied to the things that are like tied to or held or clung to most in like my identity, I guess I would say. And so now Cain's fear and God's protection still coming through. So Cain responded to this, my punishment is more than I can bear. So he fears, like he talks about being driven away from God's presence. He still names that, like, I'm in this exile and I'm like still, because it's, what does it say? You are driving me from the land and I will be hidden from your presence. So he still cares about like that relationship with God, but there's still this fear of like being exposed and killed in retaliation. So God comes back with the declaration that anyone who kills Cain will face severe consequences. And then God places this mark on Cain so that the others will not kill him. So this is like justice and mercy, right? Cain is judged, he is exiled, all of the things. But he is still also protected because he's not executed or offed or erased right there in the moment. So now we get into Cain's like genealogy and like his line of people who come from him. All right. And then we think about what comes from that, because a lot comes from this. Culture comes from this. All types of things come, but there's also an escalation in violence too. So Cain leaves the land. He settles in Nod, and then he has a son named Enoch, and he builds a city named after his son. All right. So now the genealogy is not random and is showing what comes from Cain's line specifically. So now we meet Lamech, and that is one of Cain's sons. And Lamech has 2 wives, okay? But Lamech is mentioned because it brings, the Bible goes into detail about his children, because Lamech's children are associated with some key culture developments. So he has a son Jabal and Jubal, Jabal, Jubal. So Jabal, with Jabal, there's this expansion of herding because there's tent dwelling and livestock. Whereas with Jubal, there's music. So it talks about pipes and string instruments. So think maybe harp, think flute, like just fine arts type. and then also Tubal Cain, which brought upon like the innovation of metalwork and forging tools, okay? Which back then, like that's their version of, I guess like technology, innovation, I would say. And then they also have a sister, Naamah, Naamah. Naamah is mentioned though, like no significant like culture pieces are specifically tied to her. So Lamech is key here because Lamech one day then speaks to his wife. So Lamech actually not a son because Cain gave birth to Enoch, and then to Enoch was born Irad, and then Irad was the father of Mehajuel, and then Mehajuel was the father of Methuselah, and then Methuselah was actually the father of Lamech. So sorry about that. All right, boom. I was like, that didn't seem right what I was saying, so I just wanted to make that correction. But Lamech, back to Lamech. Lamech now tells his wives, okay, and I didn't know that this was like boastfully until like I'm asking why is this significant? But he tells his wives like he killed a man for wounding him, a young man for injuring him, and then he escalates vengeance, okay? If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. So this shows like violence increasing and intensifying. So Cain kills once, and Cain feared his retribution, like what was going to happen to him. But Lamech kills, and he boasts, and he's magnifying this like ain't nothing gonna happen to me 77 times over. Okay? And there's that piece. Now, with this though, something else significant happens because Eve then gives birth to another son, Seth, because remember now Abel is dead. So Seth is like this new beginning, okay? Eve is saying that God has appointed another offspring in place of Abel. And so Seth then has a son named Enosh, okay? And what happens here is this chapter is ended with this spiritual milestone because it also lets us know that during the time of like this violence and things like that, cultural shifts are happening. It's still saying at this time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. So this is like the first explicit like note of a developing worshiping community after Eden. All right. So it's not just about like humanity getting worse. It still shows that there is faith and prayer that is also preserved. Now, what this means, okay? Sin spreads outward from disobedience to destruction. So Genesis 3, that's what showed us sin entering the human heart. And now 4, this shows sin moving into society. So it has this trajectory, right? In Genesis 3, there was distrust, shame, then hiding. And now in Genesis 4, we get this resentment, which turns into hatred, which then turns into murder. So the Bible is showing sin as a power that begins internally. It then fractures relationships, and then it creates like this social chaos, okay? From disobedience to destruction, all right? There's that. The next big thing is worship is not just giving, it's our posture and trust. So the issue with the offerings between Cain and Abel, it wasn't like what was being given, but it was the quality and the heart posture of it. So Abel offers his firstborn and the fat portions, okay? Priority, the honor of it, all right? Whereas Cain offered just some, okay? Over time, we don't know if it wasn't like mentioned it being the first or no anything like that. And that really made me think about like how, God be the last, your last resort instead of being like your first go-to. And then also with like my job and things like that, just being in education and really trying to crawl out of the space of giving like strangers the best of me and then coming home and giving my own kids like what's left, the rest of me. So definitely pulled at some internal reflection there, because basically what this portion of the Bible is saying is that God ain't impressed by religious activity if your heart is hardened, like if it's really not coming from a good place. And that worship also reveals what you trust and what you value, what we go to God with. Okay. So that was something too. Especially when thinking about what I trust and what I value, like, is that even what like God has for you, girl? And just knowing that sometimes we won't even go to God with it because it's like, well, what if God really don't want this for me, but this is what I want, you know? And then that's when we get into the whole thing of like sin and distrust, and just questioning like what God really has for us. So yeah. And then next thing, God warns before sin takes over. So God actually speaks to Cain before the murder. All right. That's big because it's meaning that anger is not condemned as a feeling, but it is treated as dangerous. Okay. But it's not condemned. And then Cain is invited to master the sin rather than be mastered by it. Because the whole sin crouching at the door line is like, it's saying like temptation. It is aggressive, but you still have agency and responsibility over this thing, right? And then that moral question that Cain tries to throw in there, like, am I my brother's keeper, right? He's trying to like sound, like, am I responsible for somebody else? But it's like, yeah, Genesis actually is saying, yeah, actually humans are responsible for each other. And indifference to somebody else's life, that is moral failure. And God does actually care about victims and not just this whole thing of like private spirituality. And Abel's blood like crying out, that is supposed to be significant of, injustice never being silent to God. All right. Next thing, justice and mercy both being present. Cain is judged. He's exiled. Okay. At a loss, all of the things. But Cain is also still protected. Okay. So God prevents vengeance from just like spiraling out of control into like this endless, bloodshed account. And the mark on Cain is supposed to like function like this restraint on violence. Like God is trying to limit the spread of it. All right. Trying to nip that in the bud. And we get with now civilization grows, but corruption can also grow with that. So Cain's line of people, they produce cities, arts, like tools, okay? So Genesis is showing us like culture developing. Humans are still creating, they are still building, but it is also showing like this progress does not automatically produce virtue. I think about like our times today and how like so much progress is made, like technology, all these advancements, all of that, but that doesn't necessarily equate to like virtue. Okay. And then that culture can coexist. It does coexist all the time with increased violence. All right. And throughout this all, last big thing here is God still preserves a worshiping line. The chapter ends with hope. Seth replaces Abel as a new beginning. People begin to call on the name of Lord. So the Lord, but isn't evil. Yes, evil is spreading, sin is spreading, but God is still preserving this line of faith and prayer and relationship. You can still be in relationship with God. Okay? Now, why does all of this matter? Okay? This all matters because, one, it explains how ordinary emotions can become destructive. So it maps out this path: disappointment, right? Because Cain is not favored. Then comparison to his brother. Now it's resentment. Now it's anger. And then now it's harm. So it's basically like just teaching us to take life serious, like our inner life, what it is on the inside, seriously. Because Cain was confronted at the anger stage, not only at murder, but like before it got there, it's the inward feelings that are confronted, right? And then why Genesis matters, why Genesis 4 matters right here. Next big thing is it challenges the lie that your choices only affect you. Cain tried to make this thing private. Am I my brother's keeper? And God said, yes, you are accountable for how you treat people, actually. And so then it reveals God's character in conflict. God warns before judgment. God hears the victim. God holds the offender accountable. But God still limits the vengeance and preserves life and worship even after catastrophe, right? And so it shows that the world is both creative and broken. Okay, it's explaining why society can be advanced. All right, we got music, we got tools, we got cities now, but we still now also have now what was violent bloodshed, like Cain, was, fearful of that, still wanted to be in God's presence. But then Lamech comes on down the line generations later, and it's boastful. It's revenge. I'm gonna be 77 times over. And that's the world we live in. And so what happens is these two like pathways kind of like form, right? So we have this pathway of like self-rule, violence, and pride versus, this pathway in calling on the Lord. So Genesis 4 is not like to shame humanity, but it now explains to us these things: how unchecked emotion becomes destruction, right? How God warns before judgment, and how justice and mercy can actually coexist, and how worship persists even in a fractured world. So unchecked emotion becoming destruction. Cain's problem is not that he feels anger. His problem is that he does nothing with it except let it grow. The progression is intentional. It's disappointment to comparison to now anger to now isolation. Now he is fixated, right? This emotion has become his identity, and now the violence happens. So Genesis is teaching that the emotion itself is not the sin, but emotion that is unexamined, unspoken, and not unsubmitted. Who we supposed to submit to? It will look for control, because fear has entered the chat, and shame and all of those things. And when we don't have this sense of security, we use control as our sense of security, and that control eventually turns destructive. So unaddressed emotion does not disappear. It just escalates. So that's why the first murder in the Bible, this is what this is. It's not about greed. It's not about survival. It's driven by resentment. And then, boom. How God warns before the judgment, okay? He warns before the murder. He intervenes at the anger stage with Cain, okay? That is big, because God is naming the emotion, explaining the danger of it. He affirms Cain's agency. You can choose. You can rule over this thing and God offers an alternative future. If you if you do good, what is good, you will be accepted. Okay? Cain is not treated like he's just doomed, okay? He is treated as somebody who is responsible and capable of making a well thought out decision. And then what this tells us about God is that judgment is not God's first move. Warning is. God does not rush to the consequences. God speaks. God invites reflection, a moment of honesty, accountability, and then offers a way back. So judgment comes after refusal of the warning, not before it. So this is trying to get us to see that violence is preventable and God actively works to stop it before it happens, right? And then, of course, how justice and mercy coexist after the murder. We get it. We got it. God doesn't ignore Abel's death. He confronts Cain, names the injustice again, declares the consequences. That's justice, all right? The violence isn't minimized. The victim is centered. Cain's life is now destabilized, okay? In the same, like, he gets the punishment that is relevant to, like, his identity and things like that. But the mercy immediately appears after, okay? Cain is not executed. God limits the vengeance. The violence isn't just allowed to spiral, okay? So justice says what you did matters, all right? But mercy says you are not erased. So there's this refusal of trying to choose between the two. Genesis 4, this part insists that actually both are necessary to prevent greater evil. All right. And then we get into how worship still persists even in a fractured world. So after all of those things, people still began to call on the name of the Lord, okay? Worship does not wait for the world to be healed, all right? And it actually arises inside of brokenness, okay? Violence does not erase God. Fracture does not cancel faith. And prayer is actually not naive. It's resistance. So worship isn't perfection. It's actually dependence. So even now, we will still speak God's name. Okay? So worship actually persists because it's not based on circumstances. It's actually based on need. All right? So Genesis 4, it doesn't tell us don't feel anger. It's telling us pay attention to it. Because what you do with it is going to shape your world around you. Okay? And it doesn't say that like brokenness is gone, or brokenness like means God is gone. It's brokenness is precisely where God still speaks, still restrains, still protects, and is called upon. Right? So when thinking about how to disrupt, because that was my next question to good old chat, was then how do we interrupt these destructive emotional cycles, right? So this is like a little guide for that. So it says that it shows us that destruction is not sudden, it's actually progressive. So we get into the trigger, comparison, emotion. We ruminate, we fixate on this thing. Now it's the isolation, loss of control, now harm, okay? So interrupting the cycle just basically means intervening early, all right? So catching the emotion early before it becomes identity, all right? What Cain did wrong, he felt anger, he let it define him. He does not ask why, he let the emotion become his story. And I think like, damn, how many times have I let some emotions become my story? So what it says into how to interrupt this cycle, name the emotion before it names you. Instead of I'm fine, this don't matter, I'm angry. I feel overlooked. I feel embarrassed. I feel threatened. And why that really matters is because unnamed emotion actually controls behavior. Named emotion becomes something you can respond to. And so, in thinking about what can be put into practice, what am I actually feeling right now beneath the surface? And then refuse comparison. Next thing is refuse comparison as your measure of worth. Okay? Cain's anger didn't just come from God alone. It came from comparison. Comparison turned into disappointment, which turned into resentment. So when trying to interrupt this cycle, when you notice comparison, ask, what story am I telling? What am I telling myself about what this means to me? Okay? Difference does not mean rejection. Another person's affirmation is not erasing me. All right? So where am I interpreting somebody else's success as my failure? All right? Next, take God's warning seriously before the consequence. I feel like I'll be better with that the more I feel like I actually really start seeking God and listening for God and stop trying to have my mind made up about what I want it to really be. And just really trying to hear God. And so what happens is God intervened, of course, before the violence, right? God names the emotion, the danger in Cain's agency. So it's saying, like, just pay attention to the early warning signs. And I'm real guilty of this, like rehearsing conversations, like replaying stuff, fixating on stuff, being wrong. I gotta go back. I hold on the screenshot. All of it. Or feeling entitled to act out the whole crash out culture. Yeah. So it's saying when the insight here is when emotion starts demanding action, that's the door. Okay. What feels crouched, what's tempting, what's knocking at my door right now, what's waiting for me to give it permission. That's a good one. And then break the isolation immediately. And that's something that I'm bad at too. Okay. Cain isolates. I know I isolate. He didn't talk honestly with God. I don't be talking honestly with God. He doesn't process with Abel. It all moves inward. And so that isolation inward, he's not justifying his emotion. Okay, so how to interrupt it? We got to speak it. We got to say the things somewhere safe before it gets or leaks somewhere unsafe. Speak the prayer out loud. Journal it. Okay, say the thing. Because what it is showing us is this. Sin grows strongest in secrecy. So where could I hear the real version of what I'm feeling without judgment? And then the next one is choosing restraint over release. Okay. Not every emotion needs expression. Some need containment. Cain released his emotions through harm. And it felt relieving in the moment, but it's devastating afterwards. So what does restraint look like? Pausing sometimes instead of confronting, delaying instead of reacting, stepping away instead of escalating. And I like this one. This is real key right here. Biblical wisdom. Power is not acting on every feeling. Power is actually ruling over what wants to rule you. So what would restraint look like you for right now? Not suppression, but wise delay. And then accepting consequences without letting them define you. Okay? If the damage has already occurred, like consequences is real. Identity, though, does not destroy because of it. So tell the truth, accept the responsibility, and then resist the whole shame-based, like this is not who you are, okay? Justice, yes, okay, it names the harm, but mercy still preserves your humanity. So what responsibility is yours? Shatima, what responsibility is yours? And then what shame does not belong to me. And then re-anchor in worship, not self-justification. Worship does not wait for emotional perfection. Worship is what's going to recenter you. It's going to reorientate worth, okay? It's going to interrupt this whole idea with self. Pray when them emotions is loud. Gratitude when the resentment grows. That's something that I really, really am trying to practice in motherhood because I am resentful, so resentful about being a single mom. I resent the hell out they daddy. And I am just trying to be more grateful for my tiny humans instead of like just seeing it as a chore. And then sometimes we got to choose silence when our words feel like, yeah. Okay. So worship is actually not denial. It's us recalibrating. Okay. So that's just asking the question of what does it look like to actually turn toward God instead of turning inward? All right. So to disrupt the whole thing, we name it, reflect, adhere to the warnings. The connection comes, restraint, and then healing. Okay. It's just about interruption. That's all it's about. Yeah, there it is.